let's go into this. This is obviously like Ted Cruz being completely repugnant.
Inclusive than what they have in Colorado or Delaware or New York. And with reaction, Senator Cruz, Senator, I'd be negligent if I didn't ask you about what's unfolding in Minnesota tonight again. And now they have a mayor talking about taking away non-lethal alternatives for police.
Well, obviously what's unfolding in Minnesota is horrific, and the violence that we're seeing has a potential to spill out and get out of control. It began with what now appears to be a tragic accident, and an accident where a man's life was taken through a mistake. Unfortunately, in the course of interactions with law enforcement, sometimes there are accidents that occur, but this is a situation where the racial powder keg that we see the left willing to light the fire of and incite violence, incite murders that we saw all across the country, murders of police officers, fires and burning of stores is wrong, and it's horrific. The shooting needs to be fully investigated. It needs to be gotten to the bottom of why that happened. But the answer is not engaging in violent riots, and there are a whole lot of Democratic politicians who celebrate and encourage this kind of lawlessness and resort to violence, and it has become a central part of the Democratic Party.
It reminds me of a headline from CNN from March. Famine has arrived in Yemen.
I was just going to say, man's life was taken.
Right. No, but that wasn't even as bad as what he said. He said, like, the accident that occurred, something like that. You know, there's no human actor involved here that caused that accident to occur. And was murder or killing uttered once? I mean, he says a man was killed, but the first thing out of his mouth was, oh, the violence in the streets. It's just the use of the passive voice.
He didn't even say man was killed. He said man's life was taken.
Oh, right. Okay. Yes, there you go. So just a great way for him to shield the world from his sociopathy.
I don't think that Ted Cruz has the ability to self-reflect, but the hesitance in his voice as he was speaking just made it impossible for me not to think that he was thinking about like the January 6th, like Capitol riots, as he was talking about about what was happening in Minnesota, because it's impossible not to think about when you watch him. And so I imagine that he in his head was like, you know, when you say these things, it just sounds a little silly. It just sounds a little silly. Of course, you know, people aren't going to make those parallels stick with him because he's been able, amazingly enough, to pretend like he had nothing to do with that. But like, it's hard not to imagine that that's what's running through his mind as he's saying it. Like, yeah, you know, the Democratic politicians who incite these sort of things and this kind of this incitement that, and you're like, yeah, you know, could you imagine anyone inciting anything, Ted Cruz?
Yeah, that's a good point. I also wonder, you know, there's no evidence that this stuff worked from a political standpoint with their people in 2020. I mean, the polling was definitely off. We just heard, this idea that Democratic politicians are inciting riots, as opposed to like, hey, there was literally a killing of another unarmed black man 10 minutes away from a trial of a killing of an unarmed black man. Like, I mean, like it's just, it's almost so absurd that you could sort of pretend that you don't see that there is something fundamentally and systemically wrong when this is happening. Like it's almost like a hat on a hat type of situation.
And how is he gonna move back into Brandon's point, you know, being pro cop when he said absolutely boo about the officer or multiple officers, you know, there were suicides afterwards in the Capitol riot. I mean, like it's almost I didn't even think about that when watching the clip about how he was trying to toe that line. Not that Republicans care about being hypocrisy shamed, but I don't know. He's got to go one way.
I think some of these statements that he makes are not necessarily for like, any particular voter, but for some reason, despite not necessarily being effective at moving votes all that well, it might be enough to pressure Democratic politicians to, symbolically condemn a few of their colleagues who are speaking out a little too loudly in favor of, BLM or whatever. But I think even that has kind of just faded away. Like, the Democrats aren't doing as much, I don't know what you call it, as much sort of appealing to that sort of racial dog whistle that the Republicans were able to better weaponize against them prior to last summer. I think now, whether or not the Democratic Party is actually pro-racial justice in any meaningful way is debatable. Probably, they're split, but the ability for Republicans to use this kind of like, well, Democrats are inciting violence to get, Democratic politicians to condemn other Democratic politicians or to infight, if nothing else seems to be waning. But I think that's like an old trick that they try to get to work, even if it doesn't work on the voters, because the Democrats can be a little bit skittish about that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And
yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that's a good point. So far, we haven't really seen too much of that, though, have we? I mean, there was an attempt coming out of the election for some of those people to say, like, this is about to fund the police. That's why I nearly lost. But there was no data to support that, and it just sort of went away.
Well, and I think also just from a practical standpoint, a lot of Democratic mayors, I can't imagine it's, comfortable to have to be at the, like, being held hostage by your police chiefs. Look at what happened to Bill de Blasio. He came in, like talking pretty leftist stuff, and like he was doing all like gonna reform the police, and now he in the middle of protest, he's walking in the streets like saying the police are great, and they're like secretly threatening his kids. And it's just like they're the practical element of this, where like there are reasons why Democratic politicians and the local and municipal levels might want to maybe not agree ideologically with defunding the police, but definitely want to rein in those powers, because like they want their own power. They don't want to be, have the thumb of the police chief under them or over them.
There's barely any Democrats left at the local level.
Exactly.
Someone should do a piece, but I saw, and I can't find it right now, but within like 100 years ago, there's explicit cases of law enforcement rejecting the will of politicians through force in this country and saying, like, in their capacity as law enforcement, and saying, we're just not going to do that.